I've spent the last 12 years of my career in the food and the people business. And as you heard, prior to that, I'd spent a big chunk of time in the energy industry, and a big part of that was spent in a unique opportunity I had, really working in diagnosing very, very complex electrical problems for high-performance energy systems. It may not seem relevant to food, but I'll come back to it in a few minutes. I'm going to start the story with my childhood. When I was a young man, both my parents worked. I was a latchkey kid, but rather than being delivered to an empty home, I would either go to one of my two grandparents. Louis Sposta, my grandparent who lived in Tigard, ran a dairy farm. Florence Ames, who was my grandmother in Tualatin, ran a filbert orchard, or you might know them as hazelnuts today. But as a kid, they were filberts. And so I grew up on these farms. And anybody who's grown up on a farm has a very unique experience because you get to see the origin of food, and today that's tougher and tougher to do. So if you've had that opportunity, you might remember that once upon a time, food was not packaged, it grew on a tree. Food wasn't processed, it grew on a tree. It was plentiful. When I asked my grandmother, could I have a snack, she would say, go climb the tree. It was amazingly diverse. To this day, I'm still stunned that my grandfather, the dairy farmer, grew so many varieties of fruits and vegetables that I don't think I ever got to the end of it. It was amazing how much you could grow on a piece of land. It was grown where you live. It was remarkably flavorful. Do you remember those times? Because if you're like me now and you go to almost any grocery store, even really good grocery stores, you run a bit of a risk actually getting something that tastes like you remember food to be. So because of my accountability in food, because of this experience of my youth, I started to ask myself questions when it came to dealing with Burgerville's food system. Along the way, the opportunity of growing up on a farm provided things that I'm not sure we all have access to today. Skipping down, the part about learning about food, about what we're eating, why we're eating it, what diversity is, and how it gets produced, I got a chance to learn alongside my grandfather, who grew all this. Along the way with Burgerville, to connect it to present time, so I'm fast forwarding, over the 12 years, we started to see an increase in a particular kind of problem. The increase was in the food supply system, and we internally refer to them as breakdowns. What would happen, there'd be a disruption in supply. And because we spend such care trying to build that supply in relationship to farmers, I started to get concerned with what's behind this. And so what I was able to do is pull something from my engineering training called root cause analysis. And I started to look at these supply chain questions and problems and breakdowns from a frame of root cause analysis. And I started to learn some things about the food in the Northwest that I don't know many of us know. What's changed since my youth to present that exacerbates this? Well, there's more people now than when I was a kid, which means more mouths to feed, more food to grow. If you look around, farms seem to be disappearing or fewer and far between. My grandparents' farm, for example, is no longer there. It's a subdivision. The farmhouse is there, but it's in the middle of the subdivision. A farmer or a rancher cannot simply use self-promotion to be successful. Too often, a farmer on the farm can't even come close to seeing the market from their farm. And so their ability to steer their future to a conclusion, to dollars, is very complicated because they can't get access to the market. And today, the toughest one of all is too often, I fear, money to be made in the food system trumps health, nutrition, quality, and sustainability. So when these breakdowns occurred, largely these things, in Burgerville, I applied root cause analysis and started to look at what's going on in the food system. Time doesn't allow me to go hugely deep, but I'll summarize. Why should we care about our Northwest food system, not the world's food system, Northwest? We're losing farmland, number one. the processes of aggregation of food, bringing it together to scale, processing it, transporting it, are really designed way back in the 50s and 60s for large-scale agricultural production. As a sidebar, something happened in the 50s that affected our food system that we may not have realized at the time. In the late 1950s, a Nobel Prize was awarded to a scientist in Iowa for the discovery of GMOs. With the discovery of the GMOs and that Nobel Prize began a campaign championed by the US that the US become the country that feeds the world. The reason that's important to this story is that that's when very large-scale agricultural production began. That's where getting the animals and the feed in one place in close proximity to really lower the cost, but to maximize the scale, took over and began to dominate the system. We're losing food diversity. Most of what's grown here is being exported, not consumed here. More of what we buy and are eating is being imported, and our risk is growing. As an example, here's a chart. I know it's kind of hard to see, but I'll try to point it out. This comes from Oregon State University, a data set that truly has tracked the food in production by acres since 1972. And the chart, the light blue that you might be able to see there, I know it's kind of hard, but the concern is the trend. You'll see it's a pretty steady downward slope with a little burps along the way. When I looked at data like this for virtually every crop in Oregon, this is Oregon data, the slope is the same, which says to me we've been decreasing production of almost every kind of food in the Northwest steadily since 1972. Here's the facts that this research and my root cause analysis has really drawn out for Burgerville in summary. We're losing land, and I don't know that we're aware that we're losing land to from food production. Succession's a big problem. How does a farmer retire exactly? And what happens when he does? Processing, that step along the way that takes something from a plant and makes it something in a jar or a can, that processing is very limited in the Northwest and largely oriented to large-scale producers. Just so I keep using that term, large-scale, something over 400 acres, mid-scale, which is mostly who Burgerville does business with, will be somewhere around 150 to 200 acres. Aggregation, places where you can gather enough food to actually look at a valid distribution system. Transportation, and then education about food and about food systems and growing. All of these things are actually weak or at risk in our Northwest food system. Some data that comes from the research that I've done. Over 57% of US farmers are 55 and older. In the Northwest, that's worse. It's closer to 70. 50 acres of farm and ranch land are lost every hour in the US irrevocably, never to be retrieved. As much as 80% of the agricultural products grown or raised in Oregon are sold out of state. Foreign markets are very lucrative, so a lot of it goes there. In 2012, Oregon produced $4.8 billion in agricultural output. In 2014, $2.6 billion in agricultural products were exported from Oregon. So in a general sense, you could say that we're exporting what we grow here for money, and we're importing what we eat, which from my perspective is concerning from a health and risk perspective. So I asked myself a simple question, and this is getting to the tip of the iceberg, not all of those, that list of concerns. But as an engineer in root cause, I started to ask myself, what if you actually could see more effectively the food system? What it does, how it flows, how the food grows from the land to the markets, could you make more intelligent choices? So I ran a bit of an experiment. I found an organization in Portland called Hack Oregon. Hack Oregon is pretty unique. They bring together computer programmers as volunteers, and they tee up key social concerns, and they asked these programmers to go to work to find publicly available data, to bring it together and aggregate it and build a database, and then create front-end portals or user interfaces for people like you and I to engage that data so that we can start to ask questions we couldn't ask now. So I'm going to show you a little bit about what Hack Oregon has done around food. This is a map from one of their trial products. It's called the Crop Compass. And this particular map of Oregon, right now we're only working with Oregon data because it's all we had available. As a side note, you find when you do this work that the availability of data for agriculture is very difficult, quite diverse and quite spread out and hard to get your hands on. None of it's in a common format. But this one in particular was worth, I think, illustrating to you. So this map of Oregon, the blue and various shades of blue are showing the grades of arable land for food production. In a sense, a simple translation was, this is the map that says where should the food be grown, okay? We can also overlay that map with where is the food really coming from, which is that map. It's hard to see, but there's places on that map where you'd go, I'm curious now. In central Oregon, you see a big chunk of blue. Very little food production is coming from that chunk of blue. I'm also curious because I know the Wallowa County quite well. I spend time there. And the dark spot in the middle of that county in the far upper right is the valley. But there's a whole bunch of food coming from the ridges and around the outside, which makes no sense at all because that's very high altitude, rocky terrain. It's not growing terrain. And so right away, this crop compass starts to raise questions about the system that I didn't have before. That's the beginning of innovation. That's the beginning of starting to look at what else could we do. If you had the facts, where's my food grown? How did it get here? How is it processed? How fresh is it? If that was available to you in any store, you'd make different decisions, I believe. Here's a case study for Burgerville. So the way we go about sourcing food is we create a specification. Specification spells out the qualities and characteristics of that food. For every protein we sell, beef, chicken, turkey, fish, everything's all hormone-free, antibiotic-free, humanely treated, traceable to its origins, and sustainably raised. Thank you. I used to think that specification was really the magic. But today I find myself with a dilemma. That specification creates a bigger challenge. Because it's differentiated food, it actually doesn't fit in the large-scale system. The large-scale system doesn't sell it. Who sells it? Mid-scale producers. Mid-scale producers are disadvantaged because the system's built for large scale. Here's our example. Our specification for chicken, which I just described in general, we went searching for suppliers for this chicken in the Northwest. Have not found any in 10 years. We have to go all the way back to Pennsylvania to find anybody who can meet that specification. Same is true with hogs. Same is true with fish. When I was a kid, all of that was here. It was here in high volume, easily to obtain. Now, I'm not a fatalist and I'm not trying to scare anybody, but we're living in uncertain times. If there is a natural disaster, how do we feed ourselves exactly? Because right now the system's sending the food other places, and the system to support getting it to us isn't really optimized. What Burgerville is going to do, and it has been a hard series of conversations, but we're choosing to build our growth on investments in the food system. Because if we don't, we won't have the differentiated food I just described.